first, like Robert said, I'm going to just do a brief market update, take some questions there, and then shift into kind of a separate topic in that I was part of a working group that USDA put together to look at some options for one-stop solution for moving cattle from one place or livestock from one place to another. So focus on that market piece first. Most of you are familiar with LMA, but for those of you who are not, we're a national trade organization that represents your livestock market. So we're not the buyers or sellers of livestock, we are that junction in between. We at LMA represent about 70% of your regularly selling livestock markets across the U.S. See where some of our 800 plus members were pretty spread out across the United States. I am based in Kansas City, do our government industry affairs work. We also have 7 regional managers that are spread out across the U.S. And I want to point out Roy Barta is here with me today. Roy, will you wave at us? Roy is with LMA. He's one of our regional managers. Roy lives in Nebraska, and he covers Colorado, Nebraska, North Dakota, South Dakota, Wyoming, and part of Kansas. So if we have some questions about markets and ADT and what some of this is looking like in the field, I'm going to maybe call on Roy as well as somebody who's been working with some of those individual markets in that region that he covers. I actually pulled up a year ago, about exactly today, we all were in Louisville, Kentucky, and we had an update from Kristen Parman, who's our Vice President of Membership Services on LMA, on animal disease traceability. It was brand new, less than a month after going into effect, and I pulled up that presentation that Kristen gave. I was also brand new. I think it was on my 2nd or 3rd week on the job, and Kristen presented a couple issues that we were having really early on, or questions we were having really early on. Some of these are going to be recurring, and some of these I think that we've kind of had progress in. First was education was our number one question or concern, making sure everybody knew what was required. We've made progress there, but I think there's still additional need for that, so I've got another slide on that. Producer access to tags was one of the big questions that markets had early on, and we had some states that were hesitant to provide those tags very freely to producers themselves, or even to like extension offices where producers could pick them up. We've seen some shifts in the last year, and probably more and more states providing tags a little wider out, and that's been positive from our perspective. Markets will vary in telling you, there's some markets that say, I want all of my consignors to bring all their livestock to me tagged. You'll get some markets that say, if I'm going to have to work some of them and tag some of them, I might as well tag them all. There's personal preferences there, but I think that it's pretty uniform that we would like at least the option to be available for producers to have access to those tags and tag prior to getting to the market. Transportation documents remains an ongoing conversation, so I've got another slide about that. Talked a little bit a year ago, or Kristen talked a little bit a year ago about database use and just concerns from producers and markets in terms of who is going to have my information, how secure will that be. We continue to get some questions there, but not nearly as many as we once did. I think that in our NIAA days, that was a predominant thing that was heard over and over again, and I'm hearing less and less of those type of concerns. Other thing that we talked about quite a bit a year ago was dairy steers, and we had markets that have dairy steers that, most of you are familiar with the federal rule. Cattle 18 months of age or older have to be officially identified. However, dairy steers have to be officially identified if they're born after March 11th of 2013. So we had some concerns from markets saying, those are really beef animals. We're not sure why we can't treat them like beef animals. But that's what the law says. So since then, we've worked with those markets, and we've got them to a place where they're officially identifying, tagging those dairy steers. I will say that it has been significantly smoother in cases where those steers are moving to back up for a second. Obviously, import requirements also vary state to state. Under the federal ADT rule, dairy steers must be officially identified, but those official IDs do not need to be listed out on your ICVI the way they do with adult animals. However, there are some states that do require that dairy steers' ICVIs be officially listed out. those conversations continue. I think that we've got markets tagging and getting them identified, but continuing to say it's awfully burdensome if we have to list all of those individual IDs out on an ICBI for those dairy steers going to those certain states that require it. So it's been smoother for those states that have gone with the minimum ADT requirements, just that there's a health certificate, but not necessarily listed on that certificate. But we're working through that. I mentioned education. I really do think that there has been a lot accomplished in the last year. A lot more people are familiar with the rule than they were a year ago. However, I think that we still have a lot of room to grow there. I'd be really interested in a survey of affected individuals, anybody who buys or sells cattle that might move interstate, and their understanding of the rule. I'd be interested in what sort of results we would get from that, but I think our money and time would be better spent increasing that education and increasing that awareness. And when I think education, I think on two ends. I think the affected individuals, the producers, the shippers, the markets, people that are going to be involved in moving cattle from one state to another in commerce. I think that markets can really be a partner if you and your states are needing places to push this information out or work with producers. Obviously, markets are a place where we have a lot of interaction with producers. We can be a partner in getting that information out. But we probably can't be the only place that information gets out. You've got producers that are not selling through markets or selling in the country. We need to use multiple venues to make sure people are understanding exactly what is required. And then the other thing that I would definitely encourage is additional education and training within your own regulatory staffs. You've got people back in the office that answer the phones in terms of answering questions about what is required, making sure that as we have new folks coming on board or even our existing staff, some recurring training to make sure anybody that could be asked questions about animal disease traceability or what's required is really fully briefed and understands well those requirements. I want to admit that I recognize that this is not an easy process. This is not a straightforward education process, and part of that is because of the way the rule did come out and the way the industry asks for some different flexibilities in the rule. So this next slide talks about some differences between states that cause some implementation questions, but also cause some education questions. USDA would have a very hard time just going out and explaining to everybody what is required, because there's differences between states on what is required based on flexibility that was asked to be put into the ADT rule. They received comments from industry that there's some folks in the West that really wanted to be able to use brands as official identification, or at least allow states to have the opportunity or the ability to decide to do so. So USDA can't send a document out to everybody or provide information to everybody saying this is official ID, because while there are certain things that are official ID everywhere, there are also states that we heard on the panel earlier that are allowing some other things to be official ID for the cases of those states. Wanted to remind everybody about the implementation survey that went out last August, or was completed last August prior to the ADT forum in Denver that USAHA and NIAA co-hosted. Big shout out goes to Neil Hammerschmidt for the work that was put into that document, as well as the National Assembly and the state veterinarians for returning that information. That helped paint a picture of exactly how many differences we do have between states. And so as we're thinking about education and implementation, that's something we're going to have to continue to wrestle with. The other piece is the fact that other state requirements may still apply. So just because you need certain things to come into a state and comply with animal disease traceability doesn't mean that there aren't other requirements that you are also going to need. And that presents another educational challenge or hurdle, because you don't want people to receive information and think that this is all that is required, where if, for example, a state also has trick testing requirements for bulls entering that state, they need to know that those things are also a component of what they need to do to legally move those animals. We've also seen a couple states, not very many, taking this time to also promulgate some state identification requirements that are separate from animal disease traceability. I'll be honest in saying that those are probably some of the states we've had a little bit more difficulties in, partially because there's been some miscommunication and misunderstanding in terms of, well, is this required under the federal ADT rule, or are you choosing to add some state identification requirements either at movement or change of ownership that are different than the ADT rule that don't have to do with interstate commerce. Probably the personal preference in most of the markets is really to focus on that federal ADT rule and getting that implemented well. We've had some confusion or some frustration in states where they're working on the federal ADT rule, and then a couple months later there's also a state identification rule coming along the lines, and it's a little bit different than the federal rule, or obviously requiring, in some cases, interstate identification. That's presented a hurdle in some cases. Tagging sites is probably one of the main changes we've seen in the last year, just in terms of the number of states that have figured out what they want to do for tagging sites, and in a lot of cases getting tagging sites agreements out and tagging sites officially approved. As you all probably know, being a tagging site, an officially approved tagging site, gives markets or other locations, a feedlot, for example, could be a tagging site if a state chose to let them be one. But for the most part, we're talking mostly about markets when we talk about tagging sites. It gives them the ability to accept out-of-state animals that are not yet identified. Most states are entering into agreements with markets and other places to become tagging sites. We have some exceptions to this. Some states have simply gone to the markets and provided documentation saying, you are an approved tagging site. For the most cases, though, there's some sort of a tagging site agreement that's been written up that states have asked markets to sign. Our strong preference with those is that those agreements remain single issue if possible, that those agreements just spell out that this is the markets to become a tagging site under the federal animal identification rule, and what is required in the market and what is required in the state. Where we run into some issues, or have ran into some issues, is when states want to add different requirements or different rules in a compilation agreement. That's caused some discomfort for some markets, and some markets to choose not to sign certain agreements. It's certainly a lot easier if we have markets call us and say, we got this from the state, should we sign it? They fax it in, and it is just regarding the federal ADT rule. It's easy for us to say, well, that if you want to be a tagging site, here's the benefit, and that's all this applies to. So that's our preference there. Most states have already had those agreements sent out. If you're in a state that is still working on that, and some still are, I know that I or our regional managers would be more than happy to have some of those discussions early on rather than later. If you've got a draft of something you want us to look at and see if we notice any potential concerns markets might have, that's something we're happy to do early on that process. And lots of states have already done that with us and been able to notice some things early on to solve problems before they even get out to the markets or become an issue. The other main thing I wanted to highlight that just seems to be a big focal point of discussion throughout this last year is the different kinds of documentation options. For those of you who were in Denver for the forum on ADT, it seemed like there was lots of confusion regarding what these were, and lots of disagreements in terms of how they would be used. Briefly, an owner-shipper statement is specifically listed in the federal ADT rule, and that is an exemption in that a livestock market that is an approved livestock facility can receive cattle that are requiring ID across state lines prior to identification without a health certificate, without an ICVI, if they move on an owner-shipper statement. To be clear, there are some states that have state import laws that require ICVIs for all cattle going into that state, so they wouldn't be looking at this sort of an option. However, that's the minority. That's just a couple states that, in a lot of cases, an owner-shipper statement is something that states are looking at and something that states are willing to use. Dr. Hall, I think on the panel, mentioned earlier that Oklahoma, as well as quite a few other states, have actually found that there are existing documents that fit the requirements of an ownership or statement. Ownership or statement requirements are actually spelled out in the definitions section of the rule in terms of requiring the shipper's name and address, a couple other pieces of information. Well, in a lot of cases, we have markets with tagging slips or some other document that already fits that definition. In some cases, they're using those as the ownership or statement, and that's been received very, very well by those markets in those states that are doing that. That's been a smooth transition. When we talk about alternative documentation, that's something different. That is the ability of animal health officials in different states to agree that instead of an ICVI, animals can move on an alternative document. And this is what one of the pieces we hear about some state agreements on. For example, in the Southeast, we've got veterinary issues in terms of just access. So maybe instead of an ICVI, which it requires a veterinarian and inspection of those animals, rather than that health document, what you need is a movement document. And so there are some states talking about providing some other kind of movement document instead of an ICVI to allow animals to move on in the context of animal disease traceability. As Neil mentioned, these are kind of ongoing discussions. A lot still needs to be seen in terms of the details here, but this is where a lot of the movement has been and a lot of the conversation has been in the last year. I do have a couple of slides looking forward on enforcement. The good news is I am probably going to be repeating some of the information Neil gave us this morning. I think that is good news because to me it indicates that USDA is being consistent and starting to provide a little bit more specifics in terms of what will enforcement look like. I'm sure it's a question you all receive as I do, just kind of still a question mark out there. We haven't seen the enforcement actions yet. What will that be like? Well, USDA, just as recently as last month, has started to provide additional information in terms of what that looks like. The administrator had a bulletin on March 4th. That bulletin provided information we've kind of been hearing all along, and that is that USDA still has the ultimate goal of compliance. They want to educate people, they want to bring them in compliance, and when they find violations, that's going to be the first step. However, if we have repeat violators that know the requirements and are willingly not coming into compliance, we are going to see penalty situations, and I think that's to be expected. Neil, this morning, I think, listed out these three priorities. USDA's going to be looking at official identification of the cattle, proper administration of ICVIs. Neil mentioned that there's still some things being figured out with those alternative documents and ownership or statements. Probably not going to be the first priority, but ICVI and making sure that those are administrated properly is what we're hearing is going to be, as well as collection of ID at slaughter. Also know that this is going to be compliance that is dealt with existing staff, that I still use the AVIC language and I'm not supposed to. Area District Director, is that the new language for AVIC, is going to initiate the case, and that would be followed up by investigative enforcement services. One thing that wasn't mentioned this morning, but it's a question we've asked and had answered is, okay, so there's possible penalties. What do those look like? This is the attorney in me coming out. I think it's important to show where that authority is and what exists. Animal Health Protection Act of 2002 does give APHIS the ability to assess a pretty wide range of penalties, ranging from a maximum for a first-time violator who's an individual in the $1,000 range on up to penalties in the $1 million range, as well as criminal penalties being possible. Do I expect to see criminal penalties based on an ADT issue? No, but that's where the authority comes from, so that's something I think it's important for us all to be aware of. One ongoing question that markets still have and I still have is the who is responsible piece, and I think that if you read the CFR, the language is intentionally a little bit broad in that it says that no person may move covered livestock interstate or receive such livestock moved interstate unless they meet the requirements of the rule. I've talked to Neil and Dr. Clifford about this, and it's going to be a fact-based determination in terms of who is the responsible party in a situation. A lot of times it's going to be obvious that the seller and the buyer that are knowing those animals are crossing state lines, they're probably responsible parties. There's been questions about whether a shipper is a responsible party, depending on their role in the whole deal. I think that from the marketing standpoint, it's important for me to know that if we have a seller and a buyer, and the buyer indicates that cattle are staying in state, and the market doesn't have any reason to believe that they'd be leaving the state, if that's misrepresented information, I don't believe markets to fall under this responsible definition. However, if they are aware and are part of that transaction in a different fact-based situation, maybe they do. So that's something that I'm expecting to see more and more information about. Neil mentioned an ADT monitoring and compliance document. It was being finalized, is now actually up online, provides a little bit more of these specifics. Last slide for me, and this is actually a question I have for USDA, for states, kind of something I want to keep in front of us, and that is consistency in enforcement. We've talked a lot about livestock markets today, in the panel and conversations all along. We talk a lot about livestock markets, and I recognize that livestock markets are a brick and mortar, easy place to go to see cattle trading hands, to see those sales happening. However, I think it's important to remember that this ADT rule and lots of other animal health requirements apply to all cattle that are moving interstate or being sold. And so my question is, how can we ensure that these requirements are being consistently enforced regardless of the method of sale of cattle? Because the last thing I want to see is enforcement be so strong in the markets it pushes people out of that environment, and cattle being sold, private treaty in the country not being identified, well, that fails to reach the goal that ultimately all of us have in identification and traceability.